Hello everybody, welcome to this part research seminar. Sorry for the slight delay. So I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Leonid Livak, who happens to be in Southampton for our biggest pleasure to examine Anushka's thesis this morning, which was Professor Leonid Livak is professor at the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Culture and the Center of Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. He has worked extensively on Russian and transnational modernism, but also on the history of Russian and French intellectual and literary contacts and transfers. He has also worked a lot on the cultural history of Jews in modern Europe and on Russian immigration. His very groundbreaking book on the Jewish persona in the European imagination, a case of Russian literature, has been very influential to many of us here. But he has also written on Russian immigrant literature and French modernism, and he's currently writing a cultural history of the end of Russian abroad in the 40s, and I know that you are also currently working in France and doing presentations on a new book on the portrayal of translator Lyudmila Savitsky. And tonight we're going to talk about integrating Jewish studies with Russian exilic studies. It's on your screen, the Holocaust and the end of Russia abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. It's a pleasure to share my research with you. Those of you, since the time constraints do not allow me to go into great detail, those interested in the subject of this presentation may write to me, and I will send you the 2 articles I published in France relatively recently that contain more information and, of course, sources. Also, just a word of warning, a lot of text that you will see on screen today will be in Russian and in French, but please don't worry, I will translate and explain as may be everything that you will see on screen. So, as a cultural community, the anti-Soviet Russophone immigration, or Russia abroad, as it was known at the time, collapsed in the 1940s. Paris became the place where Russia abroad ended, with New York taking over as the epicenter of the Russophone diaspora, smaller and qualitatively different due to the influx of Soviet displaced persons. The final years of Russia abroad are inseparable from the Second World War, but in Russian emigre memoir literature, the war is very rarely mentioned. In scholarly literature as well, the year 1940 functions as the chronological limit of Russia abroad, on the correct assumption that as a cultural community, it crumbled under the effects of wartime economic hardships, new ideological divisions, and the loss of creative freedom in Central and Western Europe under German and Soviet occupation. But there is another reason for the unraveling of Russia abroad, which is also a source of the taboo that has foiled the study of its final decade, the 1940s. I mean the significant divergence in the war experiences of ethnically Russian and Russian Jewish immigrants. The irreconcilable nature of the experiences is, to my mind, among the explanations for the quasi-silence shrouding the final years of Russia abroad. As a result, with very few exceptions, the Holocaust is absent from Russian emigre historiography. Yet, any explanation of the precipitous decline of the Russian cultural community in France, the anti-Soviet immigration's last redoubt in post-war Europe, must account for the ethnic cleansing that took place in Russia abroad in the decades between Hitler's rise to power in Germany and the Allied liberation of France. Among the salient features of the post-1917 exodus from the defunct Russian Empire was the diversity of the resultant Russophone diaspora. Exiles of Jewish origin represented its second largest group after ethnic Russians. As the emigre novelist Mikhail Sergin observed in 1925, the Russian Jewish intelligentsia was a formidable cultural force in Russia abroad. Its crucial role in the social, intellectual, and artistic life of anti-Soviet emigres has been well documented. Next slide, please. So you see some examples of that scholarly documentation on the screen. Estimates of the Jewish component of Russia abroad vary. The emigre novelist Mark Aldanov claimed in 1949 that before the war, the Paris daily Последние новости, the latest news, had over 60,000 Jewish subscribers across Europe. More recently, the French historian Catherine Goussev has argued that emigres of Jewish origin represented 5%, at least 5%, of the Russian diaspora in interwar Europe. According to the 1925 census in Prussia, which had the largest Russophone population in Germany, Jews made up to 21% of the Russian colony in that province. Data from a recent study by the German historian Bettina Dödenhöft suggests that prior to the Nazi takeover, Jews made up some 25% of Germany's Russophone diaspora, which stood at 65,000 people in 1932. Finally, in 1941, the Cossack leader Mikhail Grabe claimed that the Russian diaspora in France had been 7% Jewish. This translates into at least 5,000 people, although reporting to Vichy authorities, Grabe had every reason to play down the Jewish component of France's Russian community. Be that as it may, for the purposes of Russian exilic studies, it is necessary to distinguish between Yiddish-speaking and Russian-speaking Jewish migrants. Russophone Jews were better educated and more socially privileged. Fleeing the Soviet rule with the rest of the cultural elite of the former Russian Empire, they tended to identify with the Russian rather than Jewish exodus. For the Yiddish speakers, the situation was clear. They fled civil war pogroms and privations with no intention of returning. Russophone Jews found themselves in a much more ambiguous position. Partaking in Russian cultural life abroad, they often faced a hostile emigre public that blamed them for Russia's communist takeover. This public also flaunted Christian spirituality in contrast to Soviet atheism, and saw the continuity of Orthodox Christianity as part of the Russian emigre mission. But the same ecclesiastic heritage had been a traditional source of Judeophobia. Despite its political diversity, Russia abroad was united by the myth of a cultural mission that justified expatriation as a project for perpetuating so-called true Russian values, which according to the emigre consensus were destroyed in the USSR. In such circumstances, Jewish membership in Russia abroad was contingent on unconditional devotion to the emigre mission of preserving true Russian cultural values, often at the expense of Jewish identity. Next slide, please. While exiles of Jewish origin were very heavily represented in the editorial boards and among the contributors of the foremost emigre reviews and dailies, these periodicals tended to avoid Jewish topics in their striving to appeal to the general Russian reader. A more nuanced attitude, valorizing a mixed Russian and Jewish identity, lent itself to the charge of ethnic particularism incompatible with the unifying cultural mission of Russia abroad. In the interwar years, Russophone Jews did not see the ambient Judeophobia of Russia abroad as reason enough to withdraw from the community with which they had more in common culturally than with Yiddish-speaking exiles or with their European host societies. The political diversity of Russia abroad left enough room for Jews to find acceptance in liberal and left-wing circles dominant in Russian cultural life in Berlin before 1933 and in Paris before 1940. In exile, ethnic Russians and Russian Jews partook in the same struggle for social and cultural survival and shared the hope for an eventual repatriation after the demise of the Soviet rule. But this sense of common destiny began to unravel after France's occupation in June 1940. With the exception of prominent emigre liberals and socialists, whose anti-Nazi stance was a matter of public record, and who thus fled the advancing German army to the south of France, ethnic Russians did not fare any worse than the rest of France's Christian population. In fact, archival sources show that the German authorities treated Russians better than the Vichy regime. Unlike Vichy, which was hostile to all foreigners, the German military and civil administration readily employed and protected Russian emigres, provided they were not Jewish. Next slide, please. In October 1940, Ksenia Denikina, the wife of Anton Denikin, the former commander of the anti-Soviet volunteer army, recorded in her diary that pro-German enthusiasm among Russians in Paris, who appreciated favorable treatment and hoped that Hitler would eventually break his pact with Stalin and liberate Russia from communism, reached levels that Denikina deemed naive. In February 41, another ethnic Russian, Nikolai Vakar, an editor at the daily Последние новости, whose political liberalism made him flee the occupied zone, wrote to the Russian Jewish novelist Mark Aldanov, who had already left France for the US, that pro-German enthusiasm among Russian emigres influenced French attitudes toward them, precluding the possibility of the community's revival after the German defeat, in which Vakar firmly believed. This pro-German enthusiasm reached fever pitch in the summer of 1941. Next slide, please. Another former contributor to Последние новости, the Russian Jewish journalist Yakov Polonsky, waiting in Nice for an American visa, reported that Russians in the south of France were celebrating Germany's invasion of the USSR and packing their suitcases in anticipation of imminent repatriation. I quote, "Overall," Polonsky concluded, "our fellow countrymen have gone as far as possible in their servility toward the new masters," end quote. France's defeat and occupation upended the entire political spectrum of Russia abroad. It was logical for the diaspora's political right and extreme right to cheer German successes in the hopes that Hitler would one day destroy the Soviet regime. But it is striking to what extent the liberal elite of Russia abroad lost its political moorings. This cultural milieu, the natural home of Russophone Jews, showed little concern for the dangers faced by their Jewish compatriots. Next slide, please. A month after the fall of Paris, Ekaterina Kuskova, a veteran social democrat, reputed for her stance in favor of Jewish civic equality in Imperial Russia, summed up the current events in a letter to Vladimir Zenzinov, a socialist revolutionary. I quote, "Too bad our hearts are aged. A grandiose revolution whose final outcomes I would like to see is sweeping Europe. Thus far we see only the destruction of the old world," end quote. And she went on to reassure Zenzinov that as a pure Russian, as she put it, that's her phrase, a pure Russian, he would enjoy full freedom of travel in New Europe as opposed to the runners, biguny in Russian, as Kuskova called her colleagues, most of them Jewish, who had fled to the south of France, often with the intention of continuing their journey overseas. Another socialist revolutionary, Vadim Rudnev, endorsed the Vichy regime as a viable alternative to National Socialism and to communism after the collapse of French parliamentary democracy. Quote, I must say without equivocation that the new Pétain government is the best one under current circumstances. I sincerely wish for its success, wrote Rudnev to the literary scholar Pyotr Exilic 2 weeks after Vichy had passed its first series of anti-Semitic laws in early October 1940. In another letter, this time to the Russian Jewish journalist Mark Vishniak, his co-editor at the major Russian emigre literary review Современные записки, Contemporary Annals, Rudnev did apologize for his decision to return to occupied Paris from the free zone. He felt guilty because a German decree banned Jews from returning. Vishniak, in fact, was already on his way to New York. Such trajectories, taken in opposite directions, longtime Russian and Jewish collaborators, illustrate a growing ethnic rift in wartime Russia abroad. The bulk of the Russian colony in the Paris region did not follow the French exodus of June 1940. Those who did returned by the summer's end. Next slide. In July, Nina Berberova, a regular contributor to the political liberal emigre press, assured Ivan Bunin that their mutual friends in Paris looked to the future without fear, and were perfectly comfortable in the occupied zone. As time went on, Berberova's letters to Bunin, who was sheltering persecuted Jews at his home in the south of France, grew more enthusiastic about the political situation, especially in response to German victories on the Eastern Front. In these letters, Berberova listed several Russian writers in Paris who shared her approval of the German war effort. She was also happy that Germans were buying up books by Russian emigres, non-Jewish of course, but Berberova kept mum on that point, with the intention of sending them to the occupied Soviet territories, thus facilitating the mission of Russia abroad, whose cultural production perpetuated the values destroyed in the USSR. The experience of Russian Jewish emigres was quite different. Many Russophone Jews fled to the south, but their exodus had begun much earlier. Between 1933 and 1937, German officials recorded a 30% drop in the number of Russian emigres residing in the country. Much of it attributable to the departure of Russian Jews. Next slide, please. In 1935, describing his trip to Germany, the emigre poet Anatoly Steiger, a self-avowed Judeophobe, mentioned seeing at Vladimir Nabokov's public reading over 100 Russian Jews, quote, still surviving in Berlin, a milieu that gives me goosebumps, but without which not a line could have been printed in Russian in exile, end quote. 4 years later, the lawyer Alexei Goldenweiser informed a fellow Russian Jewish exile that all their mutual acquaintances had left Germany. Most Russian Jews left Germany for France, partly because emigration overseas was much more expensive and complicated, but also because France had a more vibrant Russian cultural community. Moving to New York in 1938, Goldenweiser complained to another former Russian Jewish Berliner, quote, there is no island of Russian refugees here comparable to those which used to exist in Berlin and which still exists in Paris. One is forced to sail the ocean of American life, end quote. Next slide, please. There is no definitive data on the number of Russian emigres who made the overseas journey between July 1940 and November 1942, when all immigration ceased due to the German occupation of southern France. Official reports show that thanks to the lobbying efforts of the Jewish Labor Committee in New York, 650 emergency visas were issued to Russian liberals and socialists and their families, most of them Jewish, although a number of ethnic Russians were included in recognition of their struggle for Jewish civic equality in the Tsarist Empire. Additional data can be gleaned from private correspondence and in the New York daily Novaya Ruskaya Slova. Based on available sources, it is safe to say that at least 1,500 members of Russia abroad, most of them Jewish, moved from France to the US between July 1940 and November 1942. Almost none of them returned after the war. Those Russian Jews who remained in France faced the increasing possibility of arrest and deportation. Foreign Jews were singled out by the Vichy regime, even if they were naturalized French citizens. In the occupied zone, the German-mandated restructuring of the administrative framework governing the presence of Russians in France sought to distinguish ethnic Russians from Russian Jews. The German and French authorities, and this is extremely important for this project, when I realized that the German and French authorities struggled to tell the difference between ethnic Russians and Russian Jews. Next slide, please. As a result, the Committee for Russian Emigre Affairs was created in Paris in 1941 and staffed by ethnic Russians who conducted a mandatory census of Russian exiles. In the process, the committee, which reported directly to German security services, created lists of Russian Jews residing in the occupied zone. This way, those Jewish members of Russia abroad who did not register during the Jewish census conducted by the French police in the fall of 1940 could be identified. As its newly appointed director, Yuri Zheribkov, put it in his inaugural speech, the committee, I quote, had been created to help and assist the Russian immigration as a whole, with the exception of the Jews, of course, end quote. Next slide, please. Beginning in July 1942, roundups targeting foreign Jews in the occupied zone left the Jewish members of Russia abroad with very few choices. One could go on living openly in the Paris region, hoping to be overlooked. This choice was common among older emigres without financial resources and those who mistakenly believed that baptism or French citizenship would protect them. Most were eventually deported to death camps. Another course of action consisted of going underground. I know of several cases when ethnic Russians helped their Jewish compatriots. However, my interviews with the families of Russian Jewish survivors suggest that their chances were directly proportional to their network of French acquaintances and a concurrent withdrawal from the Russian-speaking milieu. As I have mentioned, German and French authorities struggled to differentiate between ethnic Russians and Russian Jews, whereas Russian emigres could and did denounce their fellow Jewish exiles. Next slide. Finally, one could cross illegally into the free zone and take up residence in a location far from the large population centers where the French police rounded up foreign Jews, handing them over to the Germans. The Italian zone of occupation expanded in November 1942 to the entirety of the Côte d'Azur and the left bank of the Rhone, was a prized destination because the Italian military sabotaged Nazi and Vichy policies. Nice was especially attractive. In addition to Italian protection, the city boasted a long-established Russian colony, complete with a library, a Russian library. So here in Nice, Jewish refugees from Russian Paris did not suffer as much from cultural isolation as elsewhere in the free zone. But after the German occupation of the Italian zone in September of 1943, the presence of a Russophone community in Nice became a liability for Russian Jews. Like in Paris, Nazi Jew hunters established here a network of paid Russian informants. The leaders of this network were in fact targeted for assassination by the resistance group organized in Toulouse by the Russian Jewish poet David Knut. In other words, we're talking about a civil war inside Russia abroad, where Russians are denouncing Jews and Jews are killing Russians who are known to be denouncing Jews. Those Jews who managed to escape Nice took refuge in the region of Haute-Savoie, hoping to cross into Switzerland. In January 1944, the president of the Union of Russian Jews in New York reported that 500 Russian Jewish families were living in Swiss refugee camps. Establishing which members of Russia abroad were deported from France to Nazi death camps presents its own methodological challenges. Except for those Jewish individuals who were prominent in Russian political, social, and cultural life, the biographical dictionaries of Russia abroad keep silent about the victims of the Holocaust. This is because the authors of those dictionaries collected information in printed obituaries and by visiting cemeteries. The obvious problem with this approach is that very often entire Russian Jewish families perished, leaving no one to write an obituary or to place a headstone at a cemetery. The research I have been conducting with a team of assistants in France draws on other, mostly archival sources, namely, next slide, please, the Jewish database created by the French police in the Seine region, where most Russian Jews in the occupied zone resided, the database of the Drancy internment camp, which served as the point of departure for the majority of the deported, similar databases from the Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Rolande internment camps, two other collection points for the deportees. Finally, the passenger lists of deportation convoys from France compiled by the French historian of the Holocaust, Serge Clairsfeld. The study of Holocaust victims belonging to the Russian cultural community in France goes against the very logic of the Nazi genocidal project, which erased cultural distinctions between its targets, lumping them all into one mythical category of the Jews. Unfortunately, when it comes to the identification of the members of Russia abroad among the victims of the Holocaust in France, one cannot rely on French historiography, which uses the nationality category as it appears in French archival sources. The problem is that French authorities categorized as quote-unquote Russian any stateless immigrant from the former Russian Empire. Any. This category thus includes many Yiddish-speaking, Polish-speaking, Romanian-speaking, etc. Jews with absolutely no cultural ties to Russia abroad. They're all listed as Russian in French archival sources. At the same time, it excludes all those Russophone Jews who arrived in France with travel documents issued by the Russian Empire's many successor states, Romania, Poland, etc. Next slide, please. Just one example to illustrate this methodological quandary. Following the nationality category, as it appears in French archival sources, the Russian Jewish poet Mikhail Gorlin would not be included among Russian emigre victims of the Holocaust. Gorlin, a native of St. Petersburg, fled with his family to Vilna, which belonged to the newly formed Polish state. As a result, Gorlin arrived in Berlin, where he joined the same poetic group as Vladimir Nabokov, and later moved to Paris with Polish travel documents. Gorlin's wife, the Russian Jewish poet Raisa Bloch, who would also perish in a death camp, informed their friend, the French Slavist André Mazon, about Gorlin's arrest during the roundup of Polish Jews in Paris. I quote, Misha has been interned at the Pitevie concentration camp as a Polish Jew since May 19th, 1941. But as you know, we are both Russian, born to Russian parents in Leningrad. Thus, he is suffering without even being Polish. End quote. Since an emigre's appartenance to the Russian cultural community did not depend on his or her administrative classification by French authorities, I used a combination of criteria to identify Russian Jewish victims of the Holocaust in France. Time constraints do not permit me to go into details. Suffice it to say that I relied on the biographical information cited in the aforementioned archival sources, interpreting it against the backdrop of Jewish social and cultural history in the Russian Empire. Thus, a combination of factors, place of birth, education, profession, allows to distinguish between Yiddishophone and Russophone Jewish transplants from the former Russian Empire, especially when one accounts for additional differentiating indices, such as a victim's Parisian address. Russophone Jews favored southwestern districts with a high concentration of ethnic Russians. Yiddish-speaking Jews tended to join their cultural community in the northeastern areas of the city. Finally, my study focuses on adults only, since cultural appartenance among the children of emigres cannot be ascertained. Next slide. Preliminary research results show that at least 1,096 victims of the Holocaust in France probably belonged to the Russian cultural community, of whom 819 were beyond all doubt members of Russia abroad. This smaller group includes not only stateless persons, but also Russian emigres who were naturalized French citizens, or were listed in police files as Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Romanians, Germans, Lithuanians, Spaniards, and even Turks. Slightly more than 18% of the victims were manual laborers. A quarter exercised professions requiring university training, physicians, jurists, scientists, etc. The rest belonged to various commercial, intellectual, and cultural occupations. The latter category includes 41 writers, journalists, and editors, 37 visual and plastic artists, 9 publishers, 18 musicians, and 8 actors. In other words, the cultural elite of Russia abroad in its European epicenter was hit particularly hard by the genocide. Recall the conservative estimate at 7%, or at least 5,000 people, of the Russian immigration's Jewish component in France, cited to the Vichy authorities by the Cossack leader Mikhail Graba in 1941. In this context, the numbers I have proposed, up to 1,096 Russian Jews murdered, at least 1,500 fleeing overseas, never to return to Europe, and 500 families sheltering in Switzerland until France's liberation, may appear to contradict my claim that the ethnic cleansing of Russia abroad was among the main reasons for that cultural community's precipitous decline after 1945. But figures alone do not tell the full story. Next slide, please. One must bear in mind the central role played by the Russian Jewish intelligentsia in the cultural life of Russia abroad. The anti-Soviet diaspora in France, the brain of Russia abroad, lost to ethnic cleansing its major cultural driving force, including both cultural producers and cultural consumers. In November 1945, informing the historian Boris Nikolaevsky about the search for the books and archives looted in occupied France, the journalist Roman Gould observed that most recovered books, this is the quote on the screen, most recovered books abandoned during the German retreat belonged to Jews deported to Nazi death camps. Kuhl added that there were many Russian books among the recovered loot, unwittingly alluding to the cultural loss suffered by Russia abroad. Next. This detail cannot but recall the episode in Vladimir Nabokov's Last Russian Now, The Gift, where the protagonist's love interest, Russian emigre Zina Merz, is shown frequenting her Jewish father's relatives in Berlin, whose table talk revolves around, I quote, illnesses, weddings, and Russian literature, end quote. Sharing with Mark Aldan his impression of the state of Russia abroad in 1945, Nabokov, who had escaped to the US in 1940 with his Jewish wife and son, admitted to being tormented by the memory of murdered Russian Jews. For Nabokov, the disappearance of the Jewish component of Russia abroad meant its end as a cultural entity. Wrote Nabokov, I quote, this is the quote here on the screen, "Yes, things in Paris are kind of scary. It is painful to think about the demise of so many people whom I knew, whom I encountered at literary gatherings, and who, when I look back now, strike me as somehow celestially pure. The Russian immigration in Paris resembles the shriveled and skewed remnants of an Easter cake." I've placed the Easter cake here so you can see what it looks like. So the shriveled and skewed remnants of an Easter cake that one is vainly trying to return to its original pyramid shape on Monday after the holiday, end quote. We find an echo of Nabokov's anguish in his novel Pnim, where the memory of murdered Jewish friends haunts the Russian protagonist, who, like his creator, fled France for the US and now nostalgically idealizes the interwar emigre community in Europe. Jewish emigres who survived the war in France or overseas were in no hurry to rejoin the Russian cultural community. To understand this parting of the ways, one must appreciate the difference of Russian and Jewish war experiences. In this regard, it is instructive to compare the concurrent correspondence of Russian Jews and of ethnic Russians. Letters received by Russian Jewish painters Sergei and Ida Karsky, who were hiding with their son in a village in southern France, convey constant fear of arrest and the concomitant sense of helplessness and isolation. In November 42, the painter Georgy Ginger, who had found refuge in a village near Grenoble, wrote to the Karskys commenting on the roundups of foreign Jews in France. Next slide, please. I quote, "What horrible things they are doing to people. Germans do not surprise me, but the rest are disgusting. Expressions of outrage, protests, and no one is doing anything. Although one could have saved all these people had something been done in timely fashion. I am especially outraged by the Americans. Nothing but hypocrisy. Just think, why couldn't they shelter us all, especially since everything that had happened could have been predicted in advance. They could have done something, but no one moved a finger, instead creating obstacles of all sorts for the wretched people who tried to save themselves. For more than 2 years now, we have been living without doubt and death row, and no one has offered any help. And what about the Swiss? Nothing but hypocrisy. The Red Cross, cheap philanthropy, handkerchiefs for needy children, humanism, honor, love, freedom, such shit." End quote. So this letter could not have been more different from those written in the same year, 1942, by ethnically Russian immigrants. Next, please. The poet Georgy Ivanov wrote from Biarritz to the literary critic Ivan Razumnik, living in Germany, about his hopes for the emigres' imminent return to Russia. Ivanov saw therein the culmination of their cultural mission. I quote, "By that time, God willing, Moscow will be captured," that is to say, by the Germans. "Moscow will be captured, and maybe even the territories much further east. I do not believe that the Bolsheviks can resist for much longer. And when they collapse, Who else but us, the survivors of this madhouse, who have not been decorated by the Soviet state, could go there to salvage what remains in the burnt-out wilderness of Russian culture, putting out smoldering fires and explaining what had formerly stood there. I have been waiting for this moment for years. End quote. Or else, consider Nina Berbierova's letter to Ivanov Razumnik, coincidentally penned on the same day. Quote, June 1940, the conquest of France became a watershed for us. There had been one kind of life before, and after that moment, there came something quite different. There emerged new hopes for the first time in 20 years, and these hopes changed the basic premises of everything in our life. As for me, I am exceptionally lucky. I live at home, that is, in my own small village house, where I cultivate an orchard and a garden, where there is a semblance of stability, books, and the possibility of work. Some of my friends are now fighting on the Eastern Front, of course, against the Soviets for the German army. Fighting on the Eastern Front, the news I receive from them are the most exciting thing possible. We live here in anticipation. End quote. This ethnic fracture in wartime Russia abroad was not so much ideological as it was a product of circumstances. Emigres hoping for Russia's liberation from communism were not necessarily Nazis or anti-Semites. Yet German victories desired by many Russian emigres were bad news for their Jewish counterparts, who were the collateral damage of the liberation hopes we saw in Berbierova's and Ivanov's letters, whose authors seemed simply oblivious of the plight of their Jewish compatriots. The damage done by such indifference was irreparable. What used to be the shared hope of return to Russia and the shared sense of the emigre mission now became points of discord, since the true Russian values Berbierova and Ivanov wanted to take back home no longer appeared so true to their beleaguered Jewish colleagues. Next slide, please. Consider the already mentioned journalist Yakov Polonsky, who fled Nice in 1943 and survived the war by hiding in Grenoble. In his letters, Polonsky regularly lists those Russian colleagues who appear to sympathize with the German war effort. One such list ends with an eloquent verdict. I quote, just to think that we have lived side by side with these people for 20 years. End quote. Целых 20 лет прожили с этими людьми. Growing Jewish alienation from the Russian emigre cultural community was exacerbated by the fact that the main wartime debate in Russia abroad, to wit, should one root for Hitler's victory or over Stalin or vice versa, passed in silence the topic of anti-Semitic persecution. Such apparent indifference sapped the commitment of Russian Jews to Russia abroad and its cultural mission as much as open emigre expressions of pro-German sympathies. In the wake of the war, Yakov Polonsky explained the new rift splitting Russia abroad in France along ethnic lines. I quote, this is the second quote on the screen. He wrote, there remain so few people from our old pre-war milieu with whom one can socialize that one especially appreciates those who did not betray and did not disappoint. It is not, of course, a secret for you that here, during the years of heightened demand for human depravity, a lot, and I mean a lot, of those whom we had formerly considered decent people sided with Hitler. This has determined for the rest of my life my attitude toward others. How many of those who did not compromise themselves by their deeds out of caution acquiesced to the possible liberation of Russia from the Soviet regime at the price of the physical extermination of the entire, completely innocent Jewish people? And yet, A very large number of Russian emigres, including Democrats and socialists, did so with a quiet conscience, end quote. After the liberation of France, the country's Russian emigre population experienced its situation as more critical than at any time since France's defeat. In October 1944, 2 months after the liberation of Paris, Mark Vishniak received the following fresh news from France. I quote, "Paris has been swept by Russophobia in response to the collaboration of some Russians with the Germans," end quote. Many emigres countered such stigmatization in the French public opinion by a political about-face. Now, it became possible to be a Russian patriot by holding pro-Soviet views. This split into Soviet patriots and those who remained true to the original anti-Soviet rationale of Russia abroad became a major wedge issue in the post-war emigre community. Another wedge issue, hastening the disintegration of this cultural community, was the fact that ethnic Russians were reluctant to acknowledge the special nature of recent Jewish experience, preferring to speak about wartime hardships that had befallen Russia abroad as a whole. Next slide, please. Consider the tone-deaf comment by the writer Boris Zaitsev, who wrote to Ivan Bunin in January 1945 to defend Nina Berberova from the boycott to which she had been subjected by the Russian Jewish intelligentsia because of her recent pro-German views. Quote, "We know Nina's life very well," wrote Zaitsev. "She definitely was not involved in any kind of collaboration with the Germans, even in indirect forms, and only at times expressed, due to her hot temperament, some heretical opinions. She appreciated force, discipline, manliness, preferred Russians to Jews, and placed the Russian interests above the Jewish ones," end quote. Such resistance of Russian exiles to the Russian Jewish narrative of suffering, interpreted as selfish and oversensitive, amounted to a rival claim to victimhood. These clashing interpretations of wartime experience further poisoned inter-ethnic relations in Russia abroad, pitting Jewish exiles even against those compatriots who had not harbored pro-German views. Next slide, please. When Mark Aldanov was tasked by a New York-based Russian Writers Association to put together a list of colleagues in France who could benefit from food parcels, the association demanded that former German sympathizers be excluded. Aldanov asked the literary critic Georgy Adamovich, who had spent the war in France and was known for his anti-Nazi stance, to advise him on the candidates for the list, but Adamovich refused, suggesting that instead of sorting writers by their recent political attitudes, Russian emigres should arrange, I quote, "a solemn tea party during which, with tears and embraces, they should forget their shared sins," end quote. Adamovich's position frankly shocked Aldanov. Quote, so these are the exchanges here on the screen. "You write that we should arrange a solemn tea party during which, with tears and embraces, we will forget our shared sins," he retorted. The late Ilya Isidorovich Fandaminsky, the editor of several major Russian emigre reviews in Paris in the 20s and 30s, the late Ilya Isidorovich Fandaminsky would have probably given you his blessing, but they burned him in a furnace. Yes, they burned him. Should we be arranging a tea party and embracing those who sympathized with the very people who burned him in a furnace? I will sit this one out, end quote. In other words, Russian Jews were no longer willing to subordinate the Jewish part of their identity, awakened by the war experience, to the unifying mission of Russia abroad. Many surviving members of the Russian Jewish intelligentsia withdrew from Russian emigre cultural life in France. Aldanov did not publish a single line in the Russian emigre press in France after the war for fear of ending up in the company of former German sympathizers. Next slide, please. An equally telling example is furnished by the Russian Jewish poet Semyon Lutsky, whose family survived by hiding in southern France. After the country's liberation, Lutsky's friend, the historian and biographer Tatiana Sargina, worked to revive emigre cultural life through various initiatives, few of which bore fruit. Part of the reason her efforts were unsuccessful was the lackluster support of the surviving Russian Jewish intelligentsia. When in 1948, Sargina finally reproached Lutsky his investment in Zionism at the expense of Russian cultural causes, their friendship came to a breaking point. Wrote Lutsky, I quote, "You say you're now completely immersed in Jewish affairs. This phrase has already appeared in your previous letter, and I sense in it a reproach. Dear friend, tell me the truth. What other affairs might engage you at present? 6 million Jews have been murdered, half of Europe's Jewish population, or 1/3 of the world. All peoples have suffered in this terrible war, but none as much as the Jews. No other people was targeted for extermination with such demonic premeditation. Today, the question of Jewish independence is not theoretical, but practical and urgent. That is why I am so invested in Jewish affairs. No matter how foreign you are to anti-Semitism, no matter what close Jewish friends you have, you cannot understand this. Only those wearing the Jewish skin can." End quote. Lutsky was not the only Russian Jewish poet to withdraw from Russia abroad. Next slide, please. One of the best-known poets in interwar Russian Paris, David Knut, did not renew his ties to the émigré literary milieu after returning from Switzerland, where he had fled from the Vichy police after organizing a Jewish resistance group. His wife, Ariadna, the older daughter of the composer Scriabin, who had converted to Judaism before the war, Ariadna had stayed behind and died in an ambush. Describing his life in post-war Paris, Knut wrote, I quote, "I live not in France, but in a Jewish-Russian kingdom, almost hermetically sealed and without a view on the surrounding landscape." End quote. In another letter to another exile, Knut explained his lack of interest in Russian cultural life. Quote, "I rarely meet Russians. Many among them bet on the Germans, and I am embarrassed to look them in the eyes whenever I accidentally happen to glimpse their obsequious faces. I almost never see fellow writers. Too many among them distinguished themselves in the days of Hitler's achievements. I have no desire for a police-style inquest into each of them individually, but I am not ready yet for Christian universal forgiveness." End quote. 4 years later, Knut emigrated to Israel, limiting his Russian language publishing to a reissue of pre-war poetry. You can see here on the board. This withdrawal of the surviving Russian Jewish intelligentsia from the Russian emigre community in France exacerbated the consequences of the Holocaust for Russia abroad. While France was the only European country where the post-war revival of Russian cultural life was possible, all other emigre centers fell under Soviet control. No such revival took place. Next, please. Explaining the absence in post-war Europe of a political liberal Russian newspaper similar to defunct Последние новости, Mark Aldanov treated as equally important the geographic shrinking of Russia abroad, the ideological fracturing of Russia abroad, and the disappearance of its Jewish component. Wrote Aldanov, I quote, "Today, unfortunately, a newspaper of this kind would not find the necessary number of contributors or a relatively sizable readership. I do not know what percentage of Russian emigres in Europe sympathized with the Germans before 1944, and since 1945 with the Bolsheviks, but they represent a very large part of the Russian immigration. one could not possibly write for them. Add to this the loss of 65,000 murdered Jews who used to read последние новости throughout Europe, the loss of Poland, of the countries bordering the USSR, of Czechoslovakia, of the Balkans. So who is going to buy that newspaper? End quote. For the survivors of the Russian Jewish intelligentsia in France, dealing with the legacy of the war replaced their former devotion to the cultural mission of Russia abroad. Consider the early history of the Center for Contemporary Jewish Documentation in Paris, whose goal from the outset to our own day has been to study the anti-Semitic persecution in wartime France. The center was created clandestinely in 1943 in Grenoble by Isaac Schneerson, a Russian Jewish industrialist, aided by several other Russian Jewish exiles. Moving to Paris in 1945, the center launched a Francophone book series whose contributors were mostly Russian Jews. You see some of these books here on the screen. Among Schneerson's associates was one Lev Polyakov, whose father and uncle had been part of the editorial team of последние новости. Polyakov had been indifferent to his Jewish origins before the war. His immersion in the cultural life of Russia abroad had been such that growing up in France, he retained a strong Russian accent for the rest of his life. War experience, however, changed Lev Polyakov into a Francophone historian, Leon Polyakov, who devoted the rest of his life to the study of Christian anti-Judaism and its historical byproducts, Judeophobia and anti-Semitism. As I have mentioned, in the interwar period, Russophone Jews did not see the ambient Judeophobia of Russia abroad as reason enough to withdraw from the community with which they had so much in common culturally. But wartime experience heightened their sensitivity to the traditional imaginative construction of Jews as the others of Christian Europe. Next slide, please. For example, making an off-the-cuff Jewish joke in 1956 in a letter to the emigre philosopher Fyodor Stepun, the writer Boris Zaitsev immediately adds, quote, "Don't tell Vishniak he'll accuse me of anti-Semitism," end quote. The joke played on the traditional trope about the effeminacy of Jewish males. It cast them as bad horse riders. Zaitsev's circumspection reflected Stepun's recent clash with Mark Vishniak, who had demanded that Stepun explain why the German text of his memoirs reiterated the stuck anti-Semitic charge common in Russia abroad that Jews had fomented the Russian Revolution. Vishniak also wanted to know why this accusation was absent in the Russian text of Stepun's memoirs. Stepun's explanation suggests that the excision in the Russian edition had to do with the author's apprehension of the possible reaction from his Russian Jewish readers. Quote, I quote Stepun, "The time has not yet come for the freedom with which I wrote the memoirs. My statements are indeed inappropriate in the wake of Hitler's terrible destruction of the Jewish people. Eager not to offend anyone, and as if hearing your advice, I expurgated from the Russian edition all that puzzled you in the German edition." End quote. Vishniak and Stepun's dialogue continued, but for its entire duration, the two solitudes of Russia abroad, Russian and Jewish, produced by the war, remained irreconcilable. That is why, in another letter to Zaitsev, Stepun described Vishniak as his frenemy, druga-vrag, noting that Vishniak, quote, "sensed anti-Semitism everywhere," end quote. Quite an evolution for a former editor of the major Russian emigre review, Современные записки, which had avoided studiously Jewish topics better to focus on the cultural mission of Russia abroad before the war. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very eye-opening presentation. Questions from the audience? Tony.
Thank you very much. Were there no signs at all before the war of that, what becomes as what we describe as the civil war, of slights or anything that would make Russian Jewish exiles feel nervous or anxious about
their position in Russia abroad?
Yeah.
So before the war, there is such a political spread in Russia abroad, with such a diverse cultural community, that it is possible for a Russian-speaking Jew to feel comfortable in Russia abroad by not setting foot in those circles which are openly anti-Semitic. Because there are enough liberals, there are enough socialists, there are enough, let's put it generically, democratically thinking immigrants, that there are both in Berlin and in Paris and in Prague, for that matter. There are Russian-speaking milieu where Jews feel comfortable and at home. It changes with the war because those very circles actually begin to change themselves. They become more radicalized, they become, well, discombobulated, if you will, by what's happening. The quotes are provided. I deliberately chose quotes from people who were reputed Judeophiles, socialists, liberals, etc. They simply are unmoored by the wartime experience, by the fall of France, by the disintegration of the Third Republic, etc. And in this unmooring, in this loss of coordinates, they simply forget about their Jewish minority. And that minority feels abandoned. It feels that the community to which they have belonged for 20 years simply forgot about them.
I have a kind of precursor question, which is that unmooring predicted, or is there a precursor with the move from pre-revolutionary Russian liberals who then turned to Bolshevism following the revolution? And is there therefore is it a phenomenon that occurs across more widely Russian history?
So the myth of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, right, which is brought by Russian emigres, which is exported, let's put it this way, by Russian emigres, we have to be careful about its reception by Russian immigrants, because once again, the community itself, and there are almost 1 million people in Europe alone in the 20s and 30s, right, who are those immigrants of post-1917, is very complex, and there is a broad variety of responses to this myth. That myth is embraced wholeheartedly by the political right. However, when we deal with people that we would consider on the center and the left of the political spectrum, they are much more nuanced in their evaluation of the plain fact that the Soviet government is now exhibiting a large number, visible number of Jewish communists. How they react to this, essentially in the interwar period, determines where they stand on the political spectrum, those centrists, liberals, socialists. In your dissertation, Anushka, you wrote about Vladimir Nabokov's father, remember? And his reaction to the myth of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. This particular case is very interesting in that Nabokov's father, while he acknowledges the fact that there are many Jewish communists in the government, never makes the next step. He never says what is commonly said on the right of the Russian immigrant political spectrum, that is to say, that it's a universal Jewish plot to take over Russia in the world by exploiting the communist ideology. That is so alien to a Russian liberal that essentially they draw this line between acknowledging the fact that there are a lot of Jews in the early Soviet government. It's an especially striking fact because there had been no Jews in the Russian government previously. The switch is stunning. So it is one thing to acknowledge the clear, visible fact, and another thing to derive from it the myth of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. So essentially, anyone who actually subscribes to this myth would have been simply thrown out of the Nabokov's apartment.
Okay, Father?
No, thank you. You mentioned in the way that Russian Jewish letters were classified by the Nazis, more against it once. Russian were also passing that, right? Was there any dialogue between these different Jewish groups? You talk about the Russian Jewish groups, if they're being cast in the same net as
Excellent. Yes, thank you for this question.
the dialogue between these.
Thank you for this question. I simply didn't have time to pack it all in. Basically, what we observed in occupied France is the rapprochement. Because they're all lumped together and they're exposed to the same type of persecution, it finally dawns on French Jews that those Jews who do not speak perfect French actually are not just the shabby, stinking, despicable Ostjuden, they're actually like us. And the reactions of French Jews to this realization are varied. Some are offended to be lumped together with these people. Others actually begin to collaborate with them. So what we see is a kind of a three-way motion from the point of view of Russian-speaking Jews. On the one hand, they actually begin to collaborate actively with Yiddish-speaking Jews. The most famous example is the charity located on Rue Amelot, so the Amelot Street in the 11th arrondissement of Paris. It was essentially a canteen, a medical center, and a school. Before the war, it was catering to Yiddish-speaking Jews. During the war, not only did it begin to cater to anyone who comes, and this means a lot of Russian-speaking Jews, but it actually acquired Russian-speaking activists who came and helped. There is a collaboration between Yiddish and Russian-speaking Jews in this particular charity, and it's not the only example. Other examples include the organizations like OCHT and OZE, two organizations that were born in Imperial Russia that essentially Jewish charities. One of them is for developing Jewish professional training, another one for maintaining health standards, public health. During the 20s and 30s, OZE and OCHT are interesting phenomena because they essentially cater to Yiddish-speaking public, but the staff is Russian-speaking because it's the Russian intelligentsia hailing from pre-1917 Russian Empire. During the war, it all changes. Now, Russian and Yiddish speakers are together, staffing and running things, and the beneficiaries are also all mixed. Russians, Russian Jews, and Yiddish-speaking Jews, and anyone really who comes along. So on the one hand, this. On the other hand, what we see in the memoirs, for instance, of Russian Jews involved in Jewish resistance in France, like those I've mentioned, David Knut and Lev Palikov, both of them wrote very interesting memoirs on that in French. They show how they came closer and closer to French-speaking Jews who would not have given them the time of day in the 20s and 30s because they were not their own. They were not Israeli. They were not the cultivated French Jews. They were foreigners. It is during the war that they begin to collaborate in resistance groups. And so after the war, one of the signal phenomena for me that happens is that in 1946 in Paris, they revived the Union of Russian Jews. And then, so that's in January 46. In February of 46, it is disbanded and a new union is created. It's called the Union of Russian and Lithuanian Jews. In other words, Russian speaking and Yiddish speaking. Right? It's simply untenable after the war to separate. It makes no sense anymore. Whereas it made eminent sense to Russian Jews prior to the war.
I have questions. First question, could you say a bit more about the reason why you think this topic has been completely neglected or by the historiography?
So it has been neglected because it brings about very uncomfortable, taboo questions. The collaboration of Russian immigrants with the Nazis, that's fine. The contribution of Russian immigrants to the extermination of Jews in Europe, that's two. Considering that most of Russian immigrant historiography have been written by descendants of Russian immigrants themselves, that historiography up to the end of the Soviet Union had essentially an apologetic purpose. To write a history of the Russian immigration was to glorify the Russian immigration as the other Russia, the alternative Russia, the Russia that survived despite the Marxist dictatorship. And you throw into this such an uncomfortable topic? No, it's better just set aside and swept under the rug. And even and that I find stunning. The most authoritative history of the Russian immigration was written by Mark Rayev, a history professor at Columbia University. His book, Russia Abroad, came out in 91 or 92, I can't remember exactly. It's a volume like this. It's called Russia Abroad, A Cultural History. Not a word about the Jewish component of Russia abroad. And it stops in 1940, as usual, not to get into the uncomfortable part.
But how about Jewish historians?
So what I showed on the screen, it began in the 90s. Essentially, the series that you saw on the screen, Russian Jews in the Cultural Life of Russia Abroad, that series was launched in Israel in 1991 by a publisher and editor, Mikhail Parkhanovsky, and it ran for about 15 years. So this was the first attempt to systematize our knowledge, to try and conceptualize our knowledge of the Jewish contribution to Russia abroad. A large contribution after Parkhanovsky was made by Oleg Budnitsky, a historian who now lives in the United States, who worked extensively on the Russian Jewish Berlin. Then in the early 2000s, a group of colleagues at the Institut de Exilic in Paris organized the conference and later published a book of conference proceedings called Russian Jews, Immigrants in France, which tried to come to terms with the fact that what we know about Russia abroad in France, which was the epicenter of that cultural community, has a huge lacuna. That is, nobody is speaking about the Jewish intelligentsia, which was the driving force of cultural force of Russia abroad in the 1930s. So essentially, these three events prepared what I'm doing now.
I would ask you mentioned in your answer to a question that there was some sort of rapprochement, I suppose, between various Jewish, which is most wonderful. Do we see any sort of like, I don't know, transculturation or cultural blending between French cultural producers and Russian exilic ones that either look Jewish or non-Jewish?
So
pre-war, post-war.
For example, the Center for the Contemporary Jewish Documentation, right? So it published only in French, right? So already it catered to not Russian immigrant audience, but a French-speaking audience. And if you look at the collaboration, the names that appear on the titles of books, it's clear that it begins as a strictly Russian emigre contributions writing in French to Russian emigres collaborating with French Jewish authors. There is a realization that the center will have much bigger impact, and it makes sense now to open up. So, for example, in the book of memoirs about Jewish resistance, which David Knut publishes with the center in 1947 or 48, he still deplores the fact that there is resistance on the part of French Jews to accept other Jews as equals. So there is a clear desire to be accepted as equals, and even a programmatic striving for this. I would say that because the community itself was decimated, so few were left of Russian-speaking Jews in France, either because they were deported to death camps or they fled abroad, that to speak about a phenomenon of the merger would be an exaggeration, simply.
I still have one question, if I may, on the loyalty of these ethnically Russian emigres towards France and how their pro-German enthusiasm changed it, or whether there was some support for de Gaulle, the French resistance among these Russian emigres or not.
So, in fact, you will be able to read an article that I will publish in France in October about Russian emigres in the political purges in liberated France. So, to sum up, it's a vast topic, but very briefly, it depended on the age of the younger. The younger one was, the more one was likely to sympathize with France over Germany. Why? Because the younger one came to the country, the more culturally French one was. The more culturally French one was, the more one was attached to the adoptive country, as opposed to the country that their parents wanted to go back to. So there is a clear age split. Those who participate in resistance are much younger than those who collaborate with the Germans. Also, there is a social split. Those who collaborate with the Germans tend to come from particular circles of Russia abroad. These are former White Army people, officers, soldiers, etc., who want to renew the fight. These are also people who one could very generally describe as being on the political right of Russia abroad. Those who sympathize with France are people who are understood in today's terms as the left, that is, they're threatened by the Germans. And so France for them, but Free France, not Vichy France, is a tactical ally. But in terms of numbers, the numbers are simply, it's incomparable. The hundreds of thousands of Russian immigrants who actively or passively throughout Europe contribute to the German war effort versus a few thousand Russian immigrants who actually participate in the anti-German resistance. For one simple reason. There is a hope that the Germans will liberate Russia from communism. And this is the purpose of the incursion. To go back. They call themselves emigres, not immigrants. That is, they define themselves by having left, not having arrived. And here he is, the knight in shining armor, with the mustache, who is about to destroy Stalin's regime. Of course, they throw their life as him. In France, at least, there were no armed Russian emigre units. In Yugoslavia, Russian emigres were allowed to form their armed units and to fight on the side of the German army against communist partisans.
Any final questions? No? Final question, will it be a book?
Pardon?
Will you write a book?
I am
about-
writing.
You are writing a book, so it's
Yes.
not just articles.
Yes,
it's
but
okay.
if you're interested in the nitty-gritty of the research I presented today, the actual numbers, the sources, I will be happy to share them with you in the public.
Thank you so much. I love